Okay, guys, I hope everything's going okay for you guys right now. We're going to talk a little bit about the star life cycle and how stars live and die like everything else and what their life is like. So, the first thing we need to talk about is where all stars start. We need to stellar nebulas. Sometimes these are called stellar nursery. Oh, sorry, I don't know what happened there. Oh, goodness. Sometimes these are called stellar nurseries, okay? Because this is where all stars come from. All stars start in stellar nurseries because they are mostly hydrogen, okay? So remember that hydrogen is the principal ingredient in fusion in stars. So it would make sense that stellar nebulas are made out of hydrogen. They are different from planetary nebulas, so they're not equal to a planetary nebula, which we'll talk about that a little more here in a little bit. But planetary nebulas contain heavier elements. So just because it is a nebula does not mean that it is a stellar nebula or a planetary nebula. It has to be called a stellar nebula or a planetary nebula. So they are mostly contained of hydrogen and interstellar dust, so random elements that may be left over from something else. And they are typically very, very large, okay? And they have to be large because they're making stars. Now, as hydrogen kind of collects in itself, it forms what is called a protostar, okay? So hydrogens are attracted to each other by gravity, okay? So they basically start off individual, but they come together and they form these very close attractions to one another, okay? It's not fusion. There's no fusion, or I'm sorry, this gravity doesn't necessarily mean fusion is happening, but fusion starts in a protostar. Okay, and the reason it starts is because all these hydrogens are kind of pressing up against each other and their gravity is attracting inward. And as their gravity attracts inward, they start to fuse together to form things like helium, which we've talked about previously. Now, for an average size star, for a sun-like star, because the sun is considered an average star. Average size, average age, average fusion, everything. So, stars can go one of two ways. They can either go sun-like or they can go massive. So first we're going to talk about sun-like stars. So in sun-like stars, the gravity is in a dynamic equilibria, or imbalance is another way to say it, with fusion. Imbalanced with fusion. Okay, so there's this inward force from gravity and there's this outward force from fusion. So gravity is pulling the star in. Okay, gravity, and this may be a little hard to see, whereas fusion is pushing the star out. Okay, and this is typical. And the major fusion, reaction is the proton-proton chain that we discussed in previous videos. Okay, the proton-proton chain. Now, as they get older, sun-like stars turn into what is called a red giant star. And red giant stars are cooler than the sun. Okay, that's why they're red instead of yellow. They are heavier and bigger because of larger elements. Okay, so the protons have all reacted, have all fused together to form larger elements. Okay. So they can produce elements as big as iron. Okay. Can make up to iron. Okay. Iron is the heaviest element a star can make, period. Or a regular star can make. Heavier elements come from something else. So now, because the star is so big, we need more fusion of heavier elements. And the typical fusion reaction we see here is helium forming carbon, which goes forth to form magnesium, which fizzes into oxygen. So this is the typical fusion chain we see in red giant stars. Now, once a red giant star kind of runs out of fuel, it bursts into a nova. A nova releases more energy than the entire star. Than the star life has so far. Let me say that another way. It releases more energy in that few seconds than it has so far in the star's entire life. Okay? Now, nova is the death of a star, period. Doesn't matter what kind of star you have, a nova of any kind is the death of a star. And now it produces elements heavier than iron because so much energy is released. Heavier than iron. Okay. So once a supernova has occurred, we're left with these kind of leftovers, okay? We're left with these very, very heavy leftovers of the star. And we call that a white dwarf. A white dwarf isn't undergoing fusion or anything like that. Instead, it's giving off radiant energy. Basically like something that was heated up and now it's cooling down, okay? And they generally are in the center of a new planetary nebula. Because once we have a nova, they generally turn into planetary nebulas, which have a white dwarf in the center. The white dwarf is like the corpse of the star, if you want to think about it that way. And of course, it's still hot, so it's giving off energy, and we call it a white dwarf. This is what's going to happen to our sun. Our sun is going to turn into a white dwarf, but it has no fusion. So basically waiting for the corpse to cool off. And it turns into something called a black dwarf, which we've never seen, but we kind of theorize exists. Oh, one more thing. They are very, very dense. Okay, denser than an average star because all that mass is now concentrated. They're very, very dense. They're not black hole dense, but they're still very dense. So this is the end of the road for an average star. So let's go back to the planetary nebula, or I'm sorry, not the planetary nebula, the stellar nursery. If the stellar nursery is super, super big, it is going to turn into what we call a supermassive star. Supermassive stars are 10 times or more bigger than the sun. I'm sorry, not 10 times or more. It's 3 times to 10 times bigger than the sun. Okay. So they are hotter and brighter than our sun. They give off a lot of light. They give off a lot of energy. They generally look blue or white. Now, they still use hydrogen and helium fission. Or fusion, I'm sorry. Hydrogen helium fusion. Okay? Now, once it runs its course as a supermassive star, it gets even bigger and becomes a supergiant star, like a red supergiant or blue supergiant. Okay? So they become supergiant stars, and they are massively bigger than the sun in size. Okay? So they're massively bigger in size than the sun. They also use fusion. However, because they are so big, their fusion chain is a little different. Their fusion chain is helium turning into carbon, which then turns into oxygen, which then turns into magnesium. So its fusion chain is stuff getting progressively bigger and bigger and bigger rather than backtracking or zigzagging in size. Okay? They are not the same as supermassive stars. Okay? So a supergiant star is not the same as a supermassive star. Okay? A supergiant star is 10 times is greater than 10 times the size of the sun. Okay? Now, that is because they get bigger. So supermassive stars turn into supergiant stars. Okay? Now, once we get to the end of the road for a supermassive star, we get what is called a supernova. A supernova, this is the fate of larger stars. Okay? So supernovas are even bigger than regular novas because they come from supermassive and supergiant stars, so there's a lot more material there. They have massive energy output, more so than a regular star. So massive energy output, which is normal. Okay? Now, the thing about a supernova is there is no nebula as a result. Okay, we won't get a planetary nebula. We won't get a stellar nebula. We do not get any kind of nebula after a supernova. This material just flings outward into space and becomes interstellar dust. So that begs the question, after a supernova, what is left behind if it's not a nebula? We get what are called neutron stars and black stars. So a supernova turns into a neutron star or it turns into a black hole. I'm sorry, I said black star, it's a black hole. Okay? So if the star is 3 to 10 times the mass of the sun, okay, then we get a neutron star. If the star is greater than 10 times the mass of the sun, we get a black hole. Okay? Neutron stars are very hot. Okay? And they're similar to white dwarfs in that they're kind of just giving off radiant energy. Whereas a black hole is so massive and all energy gets sucked in. So all its energy is trapped. It doesn't really cool down. It just kind of gets trapped. Like the light gets trapped in there. And this is actually a picture of a black hole right there. party fact, this little ring of light is called an accretion disk. And this is light that manages to be near the black hole but not actually get sucked in. So it's close enough. This is similar to if you were to take a piece of clay and spin it very, very fast, it'll stretch out and then some of it will break off. Okay? There will still be a chunk in the middle, but some of the clay will break off. And an accretion disk is similar to that in the respect that energy is coming into the black hole so fast that some of it gets thrown off before it can be sucked in by the gravity of the black hole. Because there's so much gravity, it's so heavy that there's so much gravity that everything gets sucked into a black hole. Okay, so here's our two pathways for stars. This is for the sun. Okay, this is for supermassive stars. Okay, so they both start in a stellar nebula, but the average star becomes a red giant, which becomes a planetary nebula and a white dwarf. A supermassive star, however, starts off as a massive star, becomes a red supergiant, then we get a supernova, and then we have two possibilities there. We can either become a neutron star or we can become a black hole. Okay? Now, we're not going to go into too much detail about this diagram right here, this lesson, but we will in another one. And the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, okay, or an HR diagram, maps the brightness of a star, or the temperature of a star versus the brightness of a star, what we call luminosity, which we've talked about before, and the mass or size of the star. So on one side we have luminosity, on the other side we have temperature, and you'll notice by size, that's probably hard to see. You'll notice by size, we've also got that. Okay? Now, this right here is what's called the main sequence. Okay? And stars usually start up here and then slide their way down to here. Sorry you can't see that very well because I'm an idiot. Okay? Usually. There are, of course, the supergiants and the giant stars and the white dwarfs that are a little different. Now, if you happen to have any questions, please feel free to comment below, or you can send me an email, or we can talk about them in class. Thanks for watching.